I'll give you $1 million if you replace the speaker, right here in front of everyone.
I'll give you $1 million if you replace the speaker, right here in front of everyone. Richard Callahan's voice thundered through the ballroom. Laughter erupted like glass shattering. Champagne flutes trembled, and every gaze turned toward one figure. Sarah Collins, the cleaning lady, her hands still damp, clutching her rag against her chest. The echo of that challenge cut through her like a blade. She didn't move, only stood frozen under the chandeliers, while dozens of mocking eyes devoured her. No one imagined that the invisible woman they mocked would deliver a lesson that would mark this hall forever and change every soul inside. Before we begin this emotional story, tell us in the comments from which city you are watching, and don't forget to leave your like to keep following us. The ballroom of the Manhattan Grand shimmered like a jewel box. Crystal chandeliers spilled light across black marble floors, where polished shoes clicked and gowns whispered in soft waves of silk. Waiters glided with silver trays, balancing champagne that fizzed like tiny constellations. Tonight wasn't just another corporate event. It was the crown jewel of the year, the annual Whitaker Conference, a gathering where the wealthiest CEOs, investors, and thought leaders in New York City came to bask in brilliance. At the heart of the evening was supposed to be Dr. Thomas Whitaker, a Harvard professor, whose name carried the weight of authority. The printed program, now clutched in restless hands, promised his keynote on resilience and mental health in the age of high performance. For weeks, executives had bragged about securing seats, about how they would be in the room where the future of leadership would be redefined. And yet, 10 minutes past his scheduled start, the stage remained empty. Murmurs grew, spreading like smoke. Is he delayed? Flight trouble? Surely he wouldn't cancel. The whispers carried irritation, then edged into frustration. The wealthy had come to be impressed, and their patience was fraying. Couples leaned together, brows furrowed. Phones lit up, messages flew. Every second that passed without the professor was a chisel against the grandeur of the night. In the corner, nearly invisible against the grandeur, Sarah Collins wiped a streak of spilled wine from a tablecloth. Her navy uniform blended into the shadows, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly on the polished floor. She was a ghost among titans, accustomed to slipping through banquets unseen, collecting fragments of conversations without being part of them. Tonight was no different, at least for now. On stage, the microphone hissed with static, as a host stammered through empty reassurances. "I'm sure Dr. Whitaker will be here any moment," he said, his smile taut, his eyes scanning the restless crowd. But the energy in the room had shifted. Anticipation was souring into mockery. A man chuckled too loudly. A woman rolled her eyes, whispering, "We didn't come here for delays." The gala, so carefully choreographed, teetered on the edge of collapse. Then, in the center of it all, Richard Callahan leaned back in his chair, a glass of scotch in hand. He was the kind of billionaire who thrived on spectacle, his fortune made in real estate empires and hostile takeovers. The missing professor was, to him, not a disaster but an opportunity. His eyes scanned the room, searching for a stage, for a moment to amuse himself and to remind everyone of his presence. Sarah bent to gather an abandoned napkin. Her reflection flickered in the polished silver of the serving tray. She didn't notice Richard watching her. She didn't see the glint of mischief that had already begun to curl his lips. The air tightened. Somewhere, a champagne glass tipped, shattering against the marble. Conversations cut short, replaced by the hush that always precedes cruelty. Richard set his glass down with a heavy clink. He was about to stand. And in that instant, the ballroom shifted from restless impatience to the brink of humiliation. The stage lights glared against the empty podium, every second of absence pulling the room tighter. The host shuffled his notes again, his forced smile cracking at the edges. He cleared his throat, but no new announcement came. Still no sign of Dr. Thomas Whitaker. Restless murmurs swelled into something sharper. How unprofessional. We paid thousands for this. It's insulting. The glittering crowd, dressed in tuxedos and sequins, had come for wisdom but were left with nothing but silence. Laughter from one corner tried to break the tension, but it only made the irritation worse. At a side table, Sarah Collins worked methodically. She folded a napkin with precise corners, set it down and moved to wipe another wine ring. She had perfected the art of invisibility, eyes down, steps soft, breath hidden. The chandeliers above sprayed light across her apron, but no one truly saw her. She was part of the furniture, part of the quiet army that kept the night pristine. Then came the clink. Richard Callahan set his glass of scotch down, the sound louder than it should have been, slicing through the chatter. He rose in his tailored midnight blue tuxedo, his silver hair catching the light like polished steel. A mischievous grin curved across his face as he strutted to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice thick with theater, "our brilliant professor seems to have lost his way." A ripple of chuckles. He spread his arms, savoring the stage. "But fear not, I have a solution." Dozens of heads turned, relief mixing with curiosity. Anything was better than waiting. Richard let the silence stretch, his eyes sweeping the room. Then they landed on her. Sarah froze, bent slightly over a tablecloth she'd been smoothing. His grin widened. He extended a hand toward her as if unveiling a prize. "There," he declared, "I'll give you $1 million if you replace the speaker, right here in front of everyone." Laughter detonated, wild and merciless. Crystal glasses rattled as guests clapped and hooted. A man whistled. A woman fanned herself with the program. All eyes pierced into Sarah, dragging her from the shadows into a spotlight she had never asked for. Her rag slipped slightly in her hand, damp against her palm. She pressed it against her chest, as if it could shield her from the roar of mockery. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Heat crawled up her neck. The laughter didn't stop. It grew. Richard leaned closer to the mic, eyes glinting. "Come now, don't tell me you've never had something meaningful to say." He spread his arms wide, soaking in the cruelty. Behind him, the chandeliers blazed like judgmental suns. Sarah stood frozen, the ballroom devouring her silence. Her breath caught in her throat. Somewhere deep inside, a door creaked open. A memory clawing its way back, raw and uninvited. The mocking applause rolled on, but a different sound began to echo in Sarah's chest. The memory of a hospital corridor, the hum of machines, the weight of grief. And for the first time that evening, her trembling hands weren't from fear alone. Richard Callahan stood tall at the microphone, savoring the laughter as though it were applause for his own performance. His hand remained stretched towards Sarah, palm open, fingers curved in an exaggerated gesture of mock invitation. He was a showman in his own mind, feeding the gala with cruelty disguised as entertainment. "Look at her," he said, lowering his voice into a mock whisper that the mic carried across the ballroom. "She's perfect for it. Uniform pressed, rag in hand, already knows how to clean up messes. Maybe tonight she'll clean up our disappointment too." A wave of laughter crashed over the room, sharper than before. Glasses clinked, a few men slapped their tables in glee. Sarah's chest tightened as though the air had thickened, pressing against her lungs. She held her rag against her apron with both hands now, knuckles whitening. She tried to step back to vanish into the shadows, but Richard's voice cut her retreat short. "No, no, don't be shy," he teased, his grin gleaming. "You're among friends, very wealthy friends, I might add. Speak to us. Inspire us. Prove we don't need Harvard professors to teach us resilience." The cruelty landed harder for its precision, the very theme of the keynote thrown back at her like a weapon. Sarah's throat worked, dry and tight. She could feel the eyes on her, hundreds of them prying her open without permission. A man in the front row cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Let her try." Another voice joined, then another, until the chant began to rise. "Speak! Speak! Speak!" Sarah's heart pounded so violently, she feared they could see it pulsing beneath her uniform. Her first instinct was to flee, to run out through the kitchen doors and never return. But her legs betrayed her, locked in place as though nailed to the floor. Richard leaned on the podium, eyes gleaming with mischief and arrogance. "See? They want you," he said, his tone dripping with false encouragement. "Don't be selfish. Don't deny us this once-in-a-lifetime experience." A cleaning lady turned keynote speaker. "Imagine the headlines tomorrow." The room roared with amusement, but beneath the laughter, Sarah sensed something else, an undercurrent of discomfort, faint but real. Not everyone was laughing as freely now. Some eyes avoided hers, uneasy at the cruelty dressed as humor. Still, the majority pressed in, hungry for the spectacle. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat burning. The rag in her hand was damp and crumpled, but she clung to it like a lifeline. And then a memory rose unbidden. Her brother's voice, fragile in the hospital corridor, whispering that he felt invisible, that no one heard him, not really, that the world moved on, laughing, while he drowned in silence. Her eyes flicked to Richard, who was still basking in the spotlight of his own arrogance. For a fleeting moment, the fear that paralyzed her shifted into something sharper, rage. The crowd shouted again, their voices crashing together. Sarah drew in a breath, and for the first time that evening the possibility of answering didn't feel impossible. It felt necessary. The ballroom pulsed with noise, a cruel rhythm of chants and laughter that made the chandeliers tremble overhead. Sarah's pulse thudded in her ears, drowning out half the words, yet every mocking face remained sharp, etched in light. Richard Callahan leaned lazily on the podium, tapping his fingers against the microphone as if savoring the anticipation. "Come now," he drawled, tilting his head toward her. "Don't tell me you've lived all these years and never had anything meaningful to say." His smile was razor-thin, meant to cut. The audience roared, the laughter swelling and receding like waves battering the same stone. Sarah's shoes stuck against the polished marble, her knees trembling so hard she feared they might give way. The rag she clutched was soaked now, her palms slick. She wanted to vanish, to fold herself back into the shadows where no one noticed her, but the spotlight burned her skin. She was a moth pinned under glass. From the crowd, someone jeered, "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue." Another voice followed, "Come on, sweetheart, say something." The pressure built with each taunt, their voices piling on like bricks against her chest. She shook her head faintly, trying to step backward, but Richard's laughter cut across her like a whip. "Don't be modest," he sneered. "You're standing in the right place at the right time. That's more than half of success in this city. Tell us your wisdom, Sarah." The sound of her name on his lips jolted her. Few people here even knew she existed, let alone what she was called. The sudden intimacy of it felt like exposure, as though he had ripped away her last shred of invisibility. Sarah's gaze flickered across the crowd. She saw sequins glinting under the chandeliers, tuxedos leaning forward in expectation, phones raised to record what promised to be a spectacle. Not a lecture, not a speech, just another humiliation to be shared and replayed until the joke ran dry. Her throat burned with the urge to scream, but the sound caught. Instead, her mind spiraled back to the hospital corridor where she had spent nights clutching styrofoam coffee cups, back to the doctors whose jargon she forced herself to understand, back to the sight of her brother sitting small in an oversized chair, staring through the window as though the world had already left him behind. The memory lodged itself deep, hot, unmovable. And then something shifted. Her fear, though still present, found an edge. Richard smirked, leaning forward into the mic once more. "Or perhaps," he said, dragging out the words, "you've got nothing to offer. And silence, my friends, is the greatest proof of that." The crowd laughed again, but not all of them. A few faces turned uneasy, their smiles faltering. The cruelty was stretching too long, teetering on the edge of ugliness. Sarah felt it too. For the first time, she didn't just feel humiliated. She felt provoked. She drew a shaky breath, her fingers gripping the rag as though it might anchor her. Her lips parted, the first tremor of defiance gathering on her tongue. Sarah's breath rattled in her chest, shallow and uneven, as if the weight of the entire ballroom pressed against her ribs. The crowd was still laughing, though the sound had dulled into something harsher, more restless. Richard Callahan leaned back, smug, certain his game was won. And then, like a crack through glass, a memory surged. The hospital corridor. The flicker of fluorescent lights. Her brother Daniel, his voice faint, trembling. "I'm tired, Sarah. Tired of being invisible." She remembered the nights she sat awake, forcing herself to learn the language of psychiatrists and counselors, grasping for hope she could hold on to. And then, too soon, the silence that followed him into the grave. The rag in her hand shook, damp fabric twisting between her fingers. The ballroom blurred for a heartbeat, laughter fading into echoes of Daniel's voice. Pain rooted itself so firmly in her chest that when she inhaled again, something different came with it. Fire. She raised her eyes, slowly. "I don't have degrees," she said, voice trembling, almost drowned by the noise. Some chuckled, expecting a timid apology, but Sarah's next words sliced through the haze. "But I've lived what you only discuss in conferences," the laughter faltered. A glass clinked against a plate and didn't echo. Sarah's voice cracked, but it carried. "I've seen executives cry alone in their offices at 2 in the morning while I mopped the floors outside their doors. I've seen assistants fall apart in stairwells when no one was watching. And I've seen janitors, people like me, pick them up, hand them tissues, remind them they weren't alone. That's resilience." The room grew stiller. A few in the back shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Richard's grin wavered, but only for a moment. He tapped the mic, feigning boredom. "So the cleaning lady thinks she's a psychologist now?" Sarah's chest rose and fell, her fear battling the heat of defiance. She didn't look at him. She looked at the faces in front of her, the ones that had once mocked but were now listening whether they wanted to or not. "My brother fought depression," she said softly, her voice suddenly steady. "He fought harder than anyone I've ever known. And still he lost." Her throat tightened, but she pressed on. "You want to talk about resilience? It's not standing on a stage with applause. It's surviving when everything inside you is breaking apart." No one laughed. A woman dabbed her eyes with a napkin. The host, forgotten at the side of the stage, lowered his gaze. Richard cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle that rang false. "Touching," he said, his voice strained, but hardly a keynote. Sarah's grip on the rag loosened slightly. She didn't step down. She didn't retreat. For the first time that night, she stood not as a servant, but as someone unshakably present, her pain no longer hidden, her words carving into the silence like a blade. And the ballroom, once roaring with laughter, held its breath. The silence in the ballroom was brittle, as if the wrong sound might shatter it into shards. Sarah stood at the edge of the stage, the rag limp in her hand, her voice still echoing faintly in the air. The crowd of executives, men and women who thrived on speed, power, and dominance, now sat pinned in their seats, caught between disbelief and something else they couldn't quite name. Her voice trembled as she went on, but it carried, steady enough to cut through the golden light. "I don't wear designer suits. I don't sit in corner offices. I scrub those offices at night when you're gone." Her throat tightened, but she lifted her chin. "And in those hours, I've seen more truth than you ever admit to each other." A murmur ran through the room. Phones that had been raised to record mockery now captured something else. Lenses frozen on the woman who had been invisible only moments ago. "I've seen you stumble in after midnight," Sarah said, her voice gaining momentum. "Your ties loosened, your eyes red. Some of you cry at your desks. Some of you tear up photos you keep hidden in drawers. I've emptied wastebaskets filled with resignation letters that were never sent." She paused, swallowing hard. "Resilience is not about pretending you're fine. It's about waking up the next day when you're not." The room seemed to shrink around her, every chandelier, every gilded wall drawing closer. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. He forced a smirk, but his hand gripped the podium too firmly now. A man in the front row whispered, "She's right." His companion hushed him quickly, but the words lingered in the air like a spark. Sarah's eyes swept across the audience. Some met her gaze, others couldn't. "I'm not educated like Dr. Whitaker," she admitted, "but I've lived resilience. I've lived what happens when people stop talking about it and start living it in the dark where no one claps and no one sees." Her hand trembled as she lowered the rag to her side. Her chest rose and fell quickly, but she didn't step back. For the first time, she didn't feel small in the vast ballroom. She felt anchored, rooted by something unshakable. Richard chuckled suddenly, his voice booming to reclaim control. "What's next?" "She'll be teaching us business strategy." His laugh rang hollow, and fewer joined in this time. Sarah turned toward him, her eyes calm, steady. "I'm not teaching," she said quietly. "I'm telling you what survival looks like." The room absorbed her words like dry earth taking in rain. The silence wasn't mockery now. It was weight, expectation, and a discomfort that reached into places the crowd wasn't used to being touched. Sarah looked down at her rag, damp and crumpled in her fist. Then she looked back at the sea of faces, her voice barely above a whisper. "And survival," she said, "is the bravest thing I've ever seen." The chandeliers above seemed to hum with the stillness. The woman who had been a punchline stood unshaken, her words echoing louder than Richard's wealth could ever buy. Sarah's voice hovered in the still air, delicate yet unbreakable, like a thread spun from fire. Her eyes drifted over the crowd, and for the first time that night she didn't see them as predators waiting for her to falter. She saw them as people who, no matter how polished their suits, carried cracks no one else could see. She drew in a shaky breath. "I had a brother," she said softly. The words almost faltered on her tongue, but she pushed them forward. "Daniel." The name alone seemed to thicken the silence. Sarah's hand trembled as she held the rag against her side, grounding herself. "He was younger than me, brilliant, funny, the kind of person who could walk into a room and light it up without trying." Her lips curved faintly, a memory tugging at her mouth. But he carried something none of us could see until it was too late. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman shifted, her bracelet jangling against her wineglass. The sound felt too loud, like it didn't belong in this moment. Sarah's eyes unfocused, staring past the chandeliers, back into a memory she wished she could rewrite. I sat with him in hospital corridors while doctors spoke in circles. I held his hand while he told me he felt invisible, that no one truly saw him, even when he smiled. He fought for years. He fought harder than anyone I've ever known. Her throat caught, and then one night he stopped fighting. The words fell heavy into the hall. Not one laugh remained, not one phone lifted. The audience, once hungry for spectacle, was suddenly transfixed by raw truth. Sarah pressed her fingers into the rag, twisting it. "You want to know what resilience is? It's standing at his funeral and breathing when every breath feels impossible. It's picking up the pieces of your life when the person you loved most isn't there anymore." She lifted her chin, her voice gaining strength. "Resilience is surviving when everything inside you wants to quit." Tears glimmered in the eyes of strangers who had never spoken to her before tonight. A man in the second row pressed a fist to his mouth, blinking hard. A woman dabbed her eyes with the corner of her shawl. For a heartbeat, Sarah allowed herself to stand in the silence. Her grief no longer hidden, but shared, a burden she had carried alone now spilling into the room. And yet, standing taller now, she realized something. She wasn't speaking just for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had ever felt unseen. The ballroom, designed for celebration and power, had transformed into a sanctuary of pain and recognition. And Sarah Collins, the cleaning lady no one had noticed, held the entire hall in the palm of her trembling hand. The room was thick with silence, every corner of the gilded ballroom charged with Sarah's words. Executives who had arrived expecting cocktails and prestige now sat transfixed, undone by the quiet strength of a woman who was never supposed to speak. And then, like a blade slicing through fragile glass, Richard Callahan's voice rang out. "So that's it?" he scoffed, his laughter brittle. "A sob story about a dead brother? You really think a janitor knows more about resilience than a Harvard professor?" The cruelty hit the room like a slap. A few people gasped. Others shifted uncomfortably, their gazes falling to their laps. The mockery that once fueled laughter now tasted sour. Still, Richard pressed on, unwilling to lose the stage he thought was his by right. He straightened his tuxedo jacket, his eyes glinting with the arrogance that had built his empire. "This is supposed to be a world-class conference. Do you all really want to hear lectures from someone who scrubs toilets for a living?" His smirk widened, daring the crowd to agree with him. Sarah's stomach twisted, the sting of his words cutting deep. For a flicker of a moment, the humiliation returned, pulling at her like quicksand. But then she inhaled, long and steady, and raised her eyes to him. "I'm not comparing myself to Dr. Whitaker," she said evenly, her voice clear in the hushed room. "I'm telling you that pain teaches what textbooks can't, that dignity belongs to everyone, even those cleaning your floors." The words landed with a weight far greater than her trembling frame suggested. Murmurs rippled across the hall. Someone clapped once, hesitant, like a spark in the dark, but the sound was enough to shift the air. Richard's jaw clenched. He leaned forward into the microphone, Dignity, he sneered. Dignity doesn't pay bills. Dignity doesn't build skyscrapers. Money does. Power does. And you'll never have either. Sarah met his glare without flinching. Her rag hung loose at her side now, forgotten. Maybe not, she said softly, but I know what it means to look someone in the eye and see their worth, not their wallet. The crowd stirred, their unease thickening. Some nodded faintly, others crossed their arms, torn between loyalty to wealth and the undeniable truth in her words. For the first time, Richard faltered. His smirk cracked, only slightly, but enough for those watching closely to see it. He recovered quickly, forcing another laugh, but his voice lacked its earlier power. Sarah stood still, her chest rising with steady breaths. She had survived his ridicule once. She could do it again. And as the ballroom shifted, away from mockery, toward something deeper, Richard Callahan realized he was no longer in complete control. For the first time that night, Richard Callahan looked uncertain. His hand, still gripping the podium, betrayed the faintest tremor. The spotlight that once seemed his ally now cast him in stark relief, every crease of arrogance visible, every crack impossible to hide. Sarah didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, shoulders squared, her presence steady as stone. The crowd, sensing the shift, leaned in. What had begun as mockery had turned into something they could not escape. Truth. Richard tried again, but softer now. So you think your pain makes you special? His words lacked their earlier punch, his voice more defensive than triumphant. Sarah shook her head slowly. No, she said. It doesn't make me special. It makes me human. Just like you. Just like everyone here. The line struck harder than anything she'd said before. Because everyone in that ballroom, no matter how gilded their lives, carried something hidden. A divorce paper signed in silence, a child estranged, a night when they almost gave up. Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time, his eyes flickered, just for a heartbeat, with something raw. Vulnerability. Sarah saw it, though she didn't know its source. She didn't know about his son, about the addiction Richard had kept buried behind walls of money and bravado. But her words, born of grief, cut into that wound like a key turning in a locked door. You hide it well, Sarah continued, her voice low, steady. Behind the suits, behind the laughter. But pain has a way of seeping through no matter how much you try to cover it. The crowd shifted again, their silence thick with recognition. People weren't looking at Sarah anymore. They were looking at Richard. And for once, the billionaire wasn't untouchable. Richard's eyes fell. The microphone caught the small sound of his exhale, a breath that trembled ever so slightly. He reached for his glass of scotch but stopped midway, his hand suspended, fingers curling back. The arrogance that fueled him all night seemed to waver. Sarah didn't press further. She didn't need to. She stood quietly, her rag hanging by her side, the embodiment of dignity. Her silence now spoke louder than Richard's wealth ever had. And then, like a dam breaking, the applause began. It started with one set of hands in the back, tentative but sure. Then another, then dozens. Within seconds, the ballroom erupted, executives rising from their seats, clapping, some even standing, their eyes glistening. The ovation wasn't for spectacle. It wasn't for cruelty. It was for her. Richard remained at the podium, head lowered, the sound of applause crashing over him like a tide. For once he had no words, and Sarah, once invisible, stood in the light, unshaken, transformed. The ballroom thundered with applause, a storm of hands crashing together, echoing off the marble walls and crystal chandeliers. Executives, men and women who had built empires, who rarely bowed to anyone, were now on their feet, honoring a cleaning lady who had never asked to stand in their spotlight. Sarah blinked against the brightness, her chest heaving with the force of it all. She hadn't come to teach, or to lead, or to change anyone. She had only spoken because silence had become unbearable. And now, the very people who had once mocked her rose to their feet, their faces damp, their eyes wide. Her hand tightened around the rag, damp and wrinkled, grounding her in the reality of who she was. Slowly, she lowered her gaze and whispered into the microphone, barely audible above the ovation, "This is my job, but it's not my worth." The words rippled outward, striking deeper than any prepared keynote could have. Some executives wiped their eyes openly. Others pressed fists against their mouths, unable to disguise the impact. A woman in a silver gown reached for her husband's hand, squeezing it tightly. Richard Callahan stood motionless at the podium. His face, once carved in arrogance, was unreadable now. His jaw flexed, his eyes fixed somewhere far away. In his silence lay a story no one in that ballroom fully knew, the nights he had sat alone, terrified of losing his son to the shadows of addiction. Sarah's words had sliced straight into that hidden wound, and for the first time in years, Richard Callahan did not have a comeback. He lowered his gaze, and though he didn't speak, the room sensed it, the first crack in the armor of a man who had believed himself untouchable. The applause roared on, shaking the chandeliers, vibrating through the floor. Sarah stepped back, her shoulders rising and falling with each breath. She didn't bask in the ovation. She didn't wave or bow. Instead, she turned, picked up her cleaning cart and quietly wheeled it toward the side of the stage. The image struck harder than anything else, a woman returning to her work, her dignity intact, her truth spoken. She was no longer invisible. Not to them, not anymore. And as she disappeared into the shadows, the clapping only grew louder, rolling like thunder through the grand hall. In the silence that followed, long after she had gone, the ballroom no longer felt the same. People lingered, staring at the empty stage, their programs limp in their hands. They had come for a Harvard lecture, but they left carrying something far heavier and far more human. Sarah Collins had reminded them that beneath wealth, beneath power, beneath every title and degree, they were all fragile souls clinging to resilience. And that night, every single one of them walked away, changed. Sarah entered that ballroom as someone invisible, mocked, diminished, treated like nothing more than a shadow on polished marble floors. Yet she left it having touched the deepest wounds of people who believed themselves untouchable. Her words didn't come from books nor from stages, but from pain, loss, and the quiet courage of surviving one more day when it felt impossible. Even Richard Callahan, the billionaire who had humiliated her, could not escape the truth she spoke. His silence became its own confession, proof that dignity and humanity speak louder than arrogance and wealth. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, that strength isn't measured in empires or applause, but in the fragile act of standing when life tries to break you. Sarah reminded everyone in that hall, and everyone listening now, that no life is too small to hold power, and no voice too quiet to change hearts. And if tonight's story left you heavy with sorrow, let it also leave you with hope. Hope that even in the darkest corridors of grief, light can find its way through. Hope that resilience is not about never falling, but about rising again and again, with dignity intact. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this heart-touching story. Tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Subscribe and turn on the bell to receive more stories that inspire and transform. Leave a like if you believe in the invisible strength of dignity and family. And above all, thank you for being part of this community that believes in stories with soul. And before you go, watch the story. I leave here on the left. I'm sure it will also move you and make you reflect.